Welcome to everyone who's here in person. I heard traffic was a little nasty getting over this way. So thank you for trudging down the streets from wherever in town you came from and being here. We're always so grateful for this warm space of West Hills Covenant Church. They've been very gracious in opening up their space to us. So we're glad to have this place to meet, and welcome to everyone online from wherever it is that you are joining. Glad that we have that capability and option as well. Well, we are here for the first time in 2023, so I'll say Happy New Year, even though we're almost into February next week. We are meeting on the fourth Tuesday of the month this time around. That was just due to a bit of a scheduling conflict with the church on the third Tuesdays, which we normally meet. So we'll continue at least for this semester for the next few months on the fourth Tuesday for the night schools here in person. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Father Ganz to introduce us to Ernest Becker. So I won't take very long, but I will pass around this sign-up sheet as I do regularly, just to have a record of who was here so that we can send up some follow-ups. We do record the classes in case you want to go back to listen to anything. And we have people that listen on podcasts and on our website when they're able. But I'll send this around so that I can send out that follow-up information. Thanks again for being here, and I'll bring Father Ganz up.
Well, what you don't know is that Mary and her husband have their wedding anniversary today. And so there she is. They went away for the weekend with their family into Idaho and did some skiing and celebrated that way. But I certainly want to acknowledge how much I appreciate that Mary's willing to put her whole marriage in danger by coming here and be with us tonight. So many blessings in your life, Mary. Today is the feast in the Catholic calendar of St. Francis de Sales. And one of the things that's interesting about St. Francis de Sales is if you look closely at the story of the saints in the church. And what do we mean by saints? Saints is simply a technical word that not only we, but often we as Catholics, it's a technical word to describe what we would call a genuinely successful person. They really got their life, what it was for, and why they existed. And so they stand as incarnate witnesses of a kind or a pattern of life that's uniquely theirs. If you want to see diversity, a word we so adore, you will never find anything more diverse than the communion of all the saints. They're all just intensely themselves, each one, sometimes so odd in certain ways. But in that, they truly found their life and became filled with holiness of life. Truly, everything came together. And as always is the case with holy people, is they're always a problem in the communities in which they dwell. And often they're squashed regularly until they die, and then we make them saints because they endured us for that long. So it's like that. So St. Francis de Sales, also one of the things you find among the communion of saints is how often it's not just a saint alone, never is. There's always a friendship that's important. So in the history of the saints, there are some very important man-woman friendships that are hugely significant. Saint Benedict, the founder of monasticism in the West, had a sister, Saint Scholastica, very close friends. talk forever. They helped each other in their lives. St. Francis de Sales had St. Jean de Chantal, and they were closest of friends. And they together founded the Visitation Sisters, which became an important teaching order and had a tremendous influence in the West. Over and over, you'll see the pairing. It's interesting. So whenever you see a saint, you always look behind them. Who were their friends? So for St. Ignatius, it was that friends of his college roommate, Francis de Sales, St. Francis Xavier. I'm getting my Francises mixed up. Francis Xavier and Peter Faber, who is our most distinguished board member at the Faber Institute, other than Jimmy Hewlett and Pat Golding. He had his life at the time, what we call the Protestant Reformation, which is another way of saying that we Christians have a terrible time getting along, and we're our own worst enemies. We just indulge in these ways of going after each other, which is just so unhelpful. And he had to live in a time when it became not just inside the church, but it became politicized. And so it became even more dangerous. We recognize these in our own times. And so it starts connecting with other institutions, and then pain really starts happening. So one of the ways that St. Francis de Sales found to face all of that was, instead of rising up and condemning and pointing out the faults of those who were protesting, the Protestants, is he said the real issue is that we don't have enough credible examples of a truly devoted life, one completely given to God. And that's what he invested in. And through self-sacrifice and gentleness and care for the enemy, if you will, he won people, not to him, but to the God who's Wonder Counselor and Prince of Peace. He's a good example, and I'd like to acknowledge him. And so let us take a moment to pray. When we in our own lives have had people in our lives who are these credible examples of goodness, and what a difference it has made in our lives that we got to know them. Come, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, be with us tonight as we think and feel and wonder about things. And wonder how it is true, because we believe it is, that if we do this with devotion, sensitivity, attentiveness, that we're somehow part of the healing of the whole world at this one particular spot in space, time, and geographical location. Thank you for sending into the world obnoxious people with alarms so we can forgive them and practice such virtue. Amen. I didn't even look up to see who this scoundrel is. Anyway, welcome to this evening. I would like to say something about this series 12 of the night school, what the idea behind it. So each time there's a lot of discernment that goes into picking how we're going to design the night school and the Faber sessions. And I want to build it on what I'm noticing and all the people I'm in contact with every day in many different ways, and see if in all of that I can get a sense of what would be helpful now and how to do it. So series 12 explores guest by guest and month by month how it happens that when evil has gotten into the fabric of a culture. So a culture are simply the meanings and values that define a way of life for a people. It's how they understand things, meaning, and value, what they are trying to get to together. What happens when evil gets in there and starts distorting that or placing values in a people that aren't worth a life? They aren't worth our soul to go after them. What happens when that happens and people start running off after things like Isaiah would say, why do you keep running for things that fail to satisfy? Come to me, listen to me, and you shall live. Isaiah language. What happens when evil has gotten into the fabric of a culture? The soul, which is a theological word, another good word for soul, just to supply it there, is a person. A person pulls back and finds and establishes in himself or herself a defensive position in relation to the evil they sense is around them. And it usually presents itself as fear. They're afraid of something. And so people retract and put up a kind of defense, a way of finding their life that allows them to feel safe. When a person seeks a safe spot in which to hide, something Becker calls a vital lie, when this is happening on a broad front among a people in an unhealthy culture, those people, nation, government, church, whatever, will lose track of what being a human being actually is, because they pulled back from the adventure of being a human being, the going out and being bold and continuing to learn and not being afraid of other people, but engaging them, daring to offer forgiveness people who are truly different, daring to go towards people that, why should I have anything to do with them? Do it anyway. Go out, go towards. That is the soul's natural state. We pull back. So when this is happening on a broad scale, we lose track of what a human being is. Ernest Becker was onto this, and he wrote a series of important studies that got him into all sorts of trouble because he refused to stay in the box, the frame of his professional credentials. He was a cultural anthropologist, studying how human beings work within particular cultures, how cultures shape what a human being is, what a human being does to not just comply with a culture, but move because of the culture into something fuller. He was interested in that. He was born in 1925 in Massachusetts. It's hard to say that word. And I wanted to give you a sense of the unfolding of his life through these list of the works that he wrote, and you can kind of see something happening here. The first one he wrote was called Zen, A Rational Critique. And that was published in 1961. He would die in 1974. So in 1961, he published, this was his doctoral thesis. And what he was trying to study is, why is it that a person will give himself or herself over to the power of another person? So in the Zen structure, you have to surrender to a master in order to be taught and led by a master. What causes a person to surrender to someone else was what he was trying to explore. The next book that he published the next year was The Birth and Death of Meaning, a perspective in psychiatry and anthropology. You're already seeing him getting into trouble here. So he is an anthropologist who's starting to work across the ground into psychiatry. And so he's starting to alienate professional colleagues on both sides. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to stay in your lane, sort of thing. Next book, 1964, The Revolution in Psychiatry, A New Understanding of Human Being. Then Beyond Alienation, A Philosophy of Education for the Crisis of Democracy. There's a current concern when people contract and get into these, that it puts in danger our capacity to get along with each other and to have a democracy. Next book in 1968, The Structure of Evil, an essay on the unification of the science of human being. Next, 1969, Angel in Armor, a post-Freudian perspective on the nature of human being. So you can, even though you don't know what those books are about, you can see a kind of progression where he's trying to develop his life. The Denial of Death was the last one published that he was alive for. There was one more published after he died. So, but The Denial of Death was published in 1973 when he was actively filled with cancer and it was slowly eating him away. So it's an amazing thing that he would write a book, The Denial of Death, and that God would entrust to him the very experience of the thing that he's trying to study, and that the book itself was his effort to explore this reality. When I read him, I think might have been in the late 1970s when I first read this book, whatever this means. I've read so many, and probably you too, that I said then that among all the books, nonfiction books that I'd ever read, it was among the 10 greatest books I'd ever read. And I was a little nervous about coming back to the book again, because it's sort of like, when you've, gone to a beautiful place and it's so gorgeous, and you're afraid that if you go back, it won't be nearly as beautiful as your imagination has made it. So you're kind of afraid. For me, that's kind of Scotland. I want to go back, but I'm afraid that it'll wreck how profound an experience I had when I first went there. Anyway, it was fascinating to read it this time, because I recognized in certain things, I don't agree with him anymore. Things that impress me, I've grown past them. And in that regard, I feel how my life has worked. I'm different than I was, and I can kind of feel how I was, because I remember how I felt and what struck me so long ago when I was in my 20s. It is a sprawling, profound book that makes it very difficult to know. I have not, and I never do in a night school, try to give a survey of a book or anything like that. What my desire is to just expose you to some of the ideas and just go deep with them and see if it activates something in you. And maybe you might be interested in then going and reading the book if you wanted, but you wouldn't even need the book if the ideas are presented to you in a way that allows them to get into you and begin to work in you. Then you can think about it on your own and let it change you. I wanted to approach this by going through an author. Her name is Kate Bowler. She wrote an essay called "The Roof Always Caves In." And she takes this image. She is a well-known writer, writes for New York Times and stuff like that. And she's full of cancer too. And she's had to fight it most of her life. The roof always caves in is taken from the image in the gospel where there's a man who's paralyzed for life, and the four friends, unnamed, grab him and carry him to Jesus. And because the crowds are so great at the house where Jesus is teaching, they go up on the roof and bust the roof and drop their friend down through the roof to get him in front of Jesus. That's the image of the roof always caves in. But she has this to say. I want to quote a little bit from it to give you a feel for something that is a part of what Becker's describing, but I also want to appeal to you, because the only way you'll get this is you can't just think it. You have to go there in your experience. Do you know what she's talking about? What I had not learned was what Simone de Beauvoir calls our facticity. All of our freedoms, our choices, and our ridiculous attempts to plan our lives are constrained by so many unchangeable details. The fact of it's just the way it is. I was born in this particular year to those parents in this town. This medication exists and that treatment doesn't. But now it seems that all along I had these cancer cells in my colon, spreading to my liver and scattered in my abdomen because of a genetic blueprint written long ago. Facticity. An intense experience of limit. This existential state is, to borrow a term from the philosopher Martin Heidegger, the thrownness, like throwing, thrownness of life. When North Americans look for answers to our dependence, we often turn to the easy promises of the gospel of self-help. Try harder, change your mindset. You are your greatest hope. Blah, blah, blah. We bought cheap paperbacks in a frenzy to find a cure for being human. Nice line. But soon our own limited resolve and the relative weakness of our institutions conjured up the atomism, splitting off and just ending up alone, that Alexis de Tocqueville so feared. He talked about America. The English word precarity means a state of dangerous uncertainty. We get our word precarious from it. And prex in Latin means to pray, which means the thing we need, we cannot get for ourselves. We must beg it of someone else. It's a radical dependence. And that is difficult sometimes for us to handle that. I want you, if you can, in order to understand what Becker is talking about, is to recognize in yourself or people that you know who have that facticity that they're facing, no matter what they do, no matter how they wish it were different, it's just the way it is. I wish I had another life. No, you don't have another life. It's just the one you have. I wish I had a better relationship. You don't. It's just what you have. It's just the way it is. The facticity of things, that sense of limit, is a really important thing for us to acknowledge and not hide from. The next step, before coming directly into his book, has to do with, we have to talk about death a little bit. Because if it's the denial of death, I'm aware that I live in a culture, its meanings and values, that are without question designed never to talk about death, to allow fear of death to be something acceptable, rather than a profound immaturity, a refusal to grow up. I mean, we're happy to kill chickens so we can chew on them, and all that kind of stuff. We have death all around. We're causing death all the time, but we will not think about it because we're afraid to, and we certainly don't think about our own. And the problem is that as long as we stand in a fearful relation to the facticity of death that we all share, we will remain as dumb as can be about a central meaning of human living, that we have a limit. It ends in this particular frame of existence. So in order to get to the denial of death, I'd like to just open some thoughts about death that come more from our biblical Christian tradition, just to kind of thicken up the thoughts about what we're talking about here. In the rabbinic tradition, so after the fall of the temple in the Old Testament period, the destruction of the temple of Solomon during the thing, and then the great exile and going off to Babylon and all that stuff, the great temple. After that time, and then after the death of the temple that the Romans destroyed in 70 AD after Christ, the rabbinic tradition started to establish itself. And that meant that the home of the religion was not in a building and its sacrifices, but in the synagogues where the teachers taught scripture, the rabbis. In the rabbinic tradition, death is seen as a normal part of created existence. It's a fact, it just is. An essential dimension of life is right relationship to God. So what that means is, in the rabbinic tradition, in that part of the biblical tradition, to be alive means to be in relation, a living and understood and felt relation to God who created us. But here lies the ambiguity of this Old Testament concept of death. God is the source of life and of death. And death, in the biblical understanding, means relationlessness. No relation. The severing of bonds. So how is it that God created both life and death? The one is intensely about relationship. Death seems to sever relationship. It's a puzzle. Here, Romans 14, as we jump into the New Testament, Paul, of course, deeply trained in the rabbinic biblical traditions of his people. For none of us lives for himself, and none of us dies for himself. Excuse the pronoun. While we are alive, we are living for the Lord. And when we die for the Lord. And so, alive or dead, we belong to the Lord. It was for this purpose that Christ both died and came to life again, so that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. So what it suggests, and what it took a long time, some centuries to sort out, is death what is it exactly? Because if life means relationship to God, death cannot break that. So what exactly is death? Clearly the cessation of physical existence. But we never lived as merely physical existence. So the relationship. So what is death exactly? For Paul, he would speak about death as something that was a result of sin. We have to be careful in this language because physical death is not sinful. It's just the way it works. We don't say when we see a deer die or a cow or a bear that they sinned and therefore they're dead. No, it's the natural process. What Paul talks about, where sin becomes the enemy, is when we try to hold on to our physical life, no matter what, I need to continue to exist. At that point, death becomes the enemy. I'm just trying to tease you and get you to begin to think with me about no one thinks enough about death. And so to talk about its denial, it has no real content unless we can open it out a little bit here. As we move, well, Ernest Becker, one of the things he says in terms of that holding on to life, and it can be your physical life, but also can be your position. I want to always be the boss or whatever. I won't change. I want to stay this way. The selfishness of human beings seeking to protect their own existence in the face of mortality, in the face of limit, is what Ernest Becker would say would be the root of evil. When we move out of Paul and the immediate biblical tradition, testamental tradition, and come into the Christian tradition, we come into a world in which Christians are being martyred for their faith. There were 300 years where Christianity was a martyr religion. To even speak or gather like this put us all in extreme danger. We could be, police would come right in, take us out, and we would be killed for doing what we did. So death started to change from being what is death, how does it work, to an exploration of life after death. Some contemporary thoughts, again, just teasing and pushing at you. We mentioned Martin Heidegger before, and he was someone who brought some deep thinking into his philosophy around death. And he would teach that it is precisely death that allows a human life to have meaning. To live in a realistic anticipation of death is to accept boundaries and to live with purpose. Nothing is more deadly for purpose than a boundless life. I'm just going to live on and on and on. Who wants that? Just keep living longer. But if you or I knew, because I'm here to tell you that you'll all be dead in a week, and you really believed me that that was true, what would you do? Would you change what you're doing? Would you take care of something that has lain undone for too long and get to it finally? The sense of a boundary and full acceptance of it creates clarity about what time I have and what I want to do with it. Denial of death. What could that mean? Another thought from a more theological source. This is a Jesuit, Karl Rahner, a profound theologian in the 20th century. He talked about death as the opportunity to take death, which is a natural process, and take it inside our freedom and make our death a work of art. To actually do something with our dying and find that our dying actually clarifies who we finally are. Let me give you examples of this. I have noticed, because I've been with people that have been dying very, very many times in my life. And one of the things I know is that dying clarifies personality. If someone's just kind of grumpy or nasty, dying tends to magnify that. And we have examples of that. It can be very difficult. If behind what we've been able to see was a deep kindness, dying magnifies the kindness, it starts to bring out who they actually are behind their ability to suggest there's something different. In this regard, we're starting to see, and I have seen, that death is no enemy when it starts to clarify who we actually are and prepare us to meet God. So what would it be like, instead of suffering death as something we hate, to decide to turn our dying into the most beautiful expression of love for others and our gratitude that we got to be with them during the time we were here? We used to say, and we were taught when we were little kids, pray for a good death. There is nothing more beautiful than a good dying. It is really a beautiful thing in the world. But what again, and I just want to come back to this as we think about this, what exactly is death then? What dies? But what doesn't die? How many of you have people who've died with whom you still feel a living, real connection, even right now as you're thinking about them? Isn't it true that we feel them as real and with us, somehow present? And we know we're not just dreaming it and wishing it were so, and so suddenly it is. We're not fantasizing. We're talking about something that we really feel is true. What is that exactly? And if that's real and not fakery, then what is death then? Well, we know about bodies. So think of Catholic churches, and I always miss it when I come into this beautiful space. The Catholic churches, we always have a dead body right front and center. Whack. And it's not just any old dead body, it's a mutilated, murdered body. It is humans at our worst, putting something extremely ugly that should create horror, cause people when they walk in a room say, what is the matter with these people? And yet it's front and center, right over an altar, a body spread and completely helpless, humiliated, covered with wounds, dead, hanging on a cross. And it's our glory. How strange it would be if little girls with their first jewelry getting a cross. How odd it would be if they were wearing a guillotine around their neck. They wear a crucifix. What has happened here? What exactly is death? And when we're resisting death, what is it that so scares us? When right at the center of our faith is an image of death and life perfectly coincident. What is it exactly? What are we fearing? If we went to the Old Testament, we would say we fear relationlessness. And so we might say, and I always felt I was terrified. Well, there was real fear in my life that when I died, there'd be no one there. No one would stand in faith around me as I died. I was quite clear that that was unlikely. And so I would die essentially alone. None of us want that. That's something scary. What would be our dying if they're gathered around us, people that we love the most, whom we could finally say, because all the nonsense that would get in the way because of old hurts or things that had happened, we could finally get in a position to say, why, you miserable wretch, but I've always loved you, and I hope you know that. I'm just so sorry our relationship didn't work out, but honestly, it's amazing what you've done. I just wish we could have known. In other words, noble words. Why would we deny that happening? What is this fear of death? What is it are we fearing exactly? Well, part of it is I don't think we know, because we won't think about it, because our fear of it causes us not to think about it. And yet we need to, or we don't live very well. We live haunted lives. I'd like to just present to you one powerful thought from Ernest Becker. I've been coming at many different ways, trying to get you to open towards what exactly is death? Death was one of the best things that happened between me and my dad. We became much better friends in the 2 years after he died than we ever were in our life. He stood right at my right shoulder. And because I knew how to do this, and I knew our relationship, he was a good man in many, many ways, but he was rough with people, not very good with relationships. And I sensed that that would be the case with him. So I asked him, would you help me in my work? Because it would give him an opportunity to be incredibly beautiful and good in ways that he couldn't while he was alive. So I put him to work. And one thing I got from his estate was a sweater. I grabbed that. And for 2 years, whenever I had a challenging thing to do, and I almost always did, because I was always trying to push, keep reaching out, trying different things, I would put on the sweater, winter or summer. And that was, I'd say, Dad, I'll need your help on this one. And I swear, every time, I felt just a gentle touch. And I knew he was there. That happened for 2 years. And then he was gone. Only death can get there. How can we be denying death when death brings something so significant? We don't know what we're denying. Becker quotes significant philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset. I want to read this quotation because it will set up this thought. Take stock of those around you, and you will hear them talk in precise terms about themselves and their surroundings, which would seem to point to them having ideas on the matter. But start to analyze those ideas, and you will find that they hardly reflect in any way the reality to which they appear to refer. And if you go deeper, you will discover that there is not even an attempt to adjust the ideas to this reality. Quite the contrary. Through these notions, the individual is trying to cut off any personal vision of reality, of his own very life. For life is at the start a chaos in which one is lost. The individual suspects this. He or she is frightened at finding himself face to face with this terrible reality and tries to cover it over with a curtain of fantasy where everything is clear. It does not worry him that his ideas are not true. He uses them as trenches for the defense of his existence, as scarecrows to frighten away reality. Nice image. One of Becker's insights is that the reason we're so afraid of death is we've never actually lived. We have settled for a tiny slice of reality. So if reality were a circle, everything in it is reality. The universe, molecules, everything possible is inside that circle. If we were engaged with everything, it would blow us to shreds. It'd be too much to process. We'd be overwhelmed. And of course, we would be overwhelmed by anything if we drink it too fast. But anyway, so what humans do is we established a little slice of reality that we're willing to call real and simply repress everything else, just shut it out. And you hear this all the time. It shows up in our architecture, it shows up in our laws, it shows up in the way we live our lives with very specific groups of people. And this one, not this one. A neighborhood, and it has walls around it, making it very clear this is our space. It's everywhere in the human thing, which is suggestive that in order for us to live with some equanimity, we actually need to be able to do that successfully and establish a slice of a reality we can bear. The problem is when we forget that it's only a slice. Now, when an educational system is functioning correctly, it's supposed to be able to take a kid from earliest days and establish a piece of reality that he or she is able to feel comfortable and safe and free. Example, years ago, I was working one summer at St. Joe's Parish in Seattle. It's the Jesuit parish on Capitol Hill. And I enjoyed, at times, I would sit on the second floor of the Jesuit community and I would look out, the rectory, and I would look out over the back and I would watch the kids come out. It was during the summer and they would go out and play. And I was just so amazed at how growing could be so loud. You know, they just run and they just stop and they just scream and just kind of go, wow. And then just race and they have to bang into each other and they like it's, and I would reflect on how stuck I was, how proper, and I would never go jumping. And just because I felt like just burst out and scream and I'd never just run up against someone and knock them over because it felt like the right thing to do. I just felt so I would watch them and search in my heart for, what is it you're doing? What is it that I have lost? What am I missing here? I would watch them that way. Well, while I was there that summer, workmen came in and they took down all the cyclone fence around the playground because they needed to restore and put a brand new one up for the new school year that would come in the fall. And so they took it all down. Well, those kids would come out of summer school and they rush out onto the field. There was a play structure over there. It was the most striking thing. They all just stayed at the play structure. And they had this whole playground to play. And they just stayed there. And I was so puzzled by that. Why? And then after a week or two, after they had put in the new big stanchions, and put in the concrete and got all the poles up, one day they came and they just rolled out the fencing all the way down the line and around, hooked it up and clicked it. Next day, the same kids pour out into the playground. I swear to God, they went everywhere in the playground. And not only that, but the boys would kick the ball at the fence. And it was especially cool if they were really strong and they could kick it over the fence so it'd go bouncing out of bounds over there where you couldn't get it. If someone has a clear and understood boundary, it sets them free to explore in the space that that boundary allows. And so the art of teaching is to be able in intellectual and emotional ways to set up a clear enough boundary that's big enough that truly allows exploration and things to happen in it, but doesn't create fear because there's too much life, too much adventure. Humans have done that all the time. We're afraid of death because we're afraid of life in all its richness. And so we establish a boundary that we think we can live in, but usually we don't establish the boundary. We usually allow that boundary to be established by people we assume know what they're doing, or we assume they're the right group, or we assume I want to be like them. And so they have put down a boundary, even though it might not be helpful to us at all. And we conform ourselves to dwell in that space. But by God, don't you challenge the boundary or go beyond it. Ernest Becker in his life over and over got into trouble because his thought carried him beyond his discipline into other disciplines. He broke the rule of the boundary and lived across those things. And so he became a pariah in the academic scene, and they kicked him out of departments. And then when he saw the United States doing it during the Great Vietnam War, and this is how it's supposed to look, and this is what you're supposed to do, he ended up going to Canada. Ernest Becker says that part of the thing with humans is in order to prosper, we need to successfully establish what he calls a vital lie. It's a lie because it's only a tiny piece of the vast richness of the universe. Tiny piece. For heaven's sakes, we're just earthlings. We just live on one planet, for heaven's sakes. I mean, talk about small piece of reality. But we're just so outsized in our egos about how much reality we think we are. We're just tiny. So, but we need to have a place to establish ourselves where we can feel comfortable and safe and able to explore. But so it's vital that we do that. If we don't, that's where psychosis happens. That's where neuroses of all kinds. If we're unable to successfully establish a piece of reality in which we can successfully function, we're in trouble. It's vital that we lie in this way. The problem, and what Becker is doing in the book, is getting us to acknowledge that it's a lie and that reality is far bigger than our comfortable space is comfortable acknowledging. So what I used to describe to students when I taught them at Jesuit High is one of the things I would say to them. I said, I want this classroom to be one of the most dangerous places in your day. I want this to be a dangerous space. And what I mean by it is I'm going to do everything I can to catch you in the piece of your life that you have and push you a little bit. Because I think that's what God will do always. Trust me, push farther, reach farther, look over that fence. Just take a look. No harm in it. And I'll be here. And any questions that start to happen, I'll be right there with you because I've done that before. So I know what that is, but you'll have your own version of it. The vital lie is what Ernest Becker calls character. A person of good character would mean someone who's successfully established a piece of the action where he or she can function successfully. I don't think we think much about what character is. We assume it's some sort of mystical thing, or you have character and good character. But think how often when someone is called a person of good character, it often means you're kind of like me. You're kind of like my best version of me, even though I might not be there all the time, but you do things all the right way. You're kind of, you fit. And how we can call someone who lives a very different reality and does not live that frame at all. In fact, would find that suffocating to step into my piece of the pie. It's not like them at all. I could question their character because they don't fit in. You see what we're playing with here? So character for him is a very cultural thing. What does character mean in a godly way? So to use in the Catholic world, we talk about sacraments, encounters with the holy. That there are two sacraments that impart a character, caractère, we say. And that's baptism. And I didn't put this, well, anyway, and priesthood. I don't know why marriage isn't a character sacrament. I really don't. To me, that is the most common one that imparts a permanent character. But it's because priests were better than you. It's just so obvious, really. Oh my God. But what is a character? Caractère in Greek. What it means is this, just catch the image, is in the ancient world and through the medieval world, when heads of state wanted to communicate with each other, they had two ways of safely doing that. One was to write down what they wanted to say to the other king, let's say. Would write it down, roll it up, would drip wax on the place where it, on the edge, and then would take the signet ring, which was the sign of the royal power, and would impress it in the wax. And then that would seal this thing so it couldn't be unrolled. If it had been peeked at when it shouldn't have been, it would have broken the seal of the wax, you see? So you poured the wax over the edge and then put your signet ring. Greek, the word caractère is the impression left by a signet ring in wax. Cool, right? So what we're saying in the sacraments, those two sacraments, is, if you will, we are God's messengers to the world, in which God has written a message to be given to the world. And it's as if in this sacramental action, God takes his signet ring, pours wax over that message, and puts his mark in it. So that when we go out as baptized people in the world, as Christians, it's as if God is saying, and he actually is saying, that in this person, you have me. And that was the understanding in the royal communications. When the message was handed, that was that king giving his message personally to that other person, even though it was delivered by a messenger. Okay? Character, in Becker's way of understanding, is what a culture will do when it makes you and me act appropriately. Be a good American, let's say. Be the right kind of American, or whatever it happens to be. It's a powerful imprint. So what happens when we forget what that even means? The imprint put on us by, if you will, the founding people. What if we lose the character? We're done, because we just stop when it's time. My hope with you was that I teased you, pushed at you, made you wonder. I was telling someone, some of you know her, she lost her mom a few days ago. And she, like so many people, has almost no understanding of anything to do with death because they've been afraid of it their whole life. And he said, Sharon, just remember, death is the only thing that knows the way to the ancestors. It's the only thing that knows. So what exactly is death? And why do we fear it? It's worth wondering about. Give me a second here. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, I pray you, Lord, my soul to take. Amen.
Thank you again for being here in person and online. And as I mentioned, I'll send a follow-up email tomorrow, just with some additional resources. As Rick said, hoping to tease you. Maybe there are some books or additional resources that we can offer that you would like to dive into after this talk. A couple other upcoming gatherings that we have, we'll start a new series of the Faber sessions, which is online only. And that'll be the second Monday of the month. As I mentioned, we've kind of shifted our habits back a week for at least this semester. So the second Monday of February, we'll start our new Faber sessions, and that will be one on poetry again. So we'll be kicking that off with poems from the Bible, and it will be some select poetry from Isaiah and the Psalms that we will be looking at that evening. And then next month, we will continue our night schools here in person and online, and that will be with our special guest, Frederick Douglass, which Rick will introduce us to. In between there, we have a Lenten evening that we host annually, and that's the evening before Ash Wednesday. So I'll have information about that as well. Some of you had asked about support of the Faber Institute, how it is that we have gatherings like this, and we are a nonprofit completely funded by individuals, and we like to offer what we have freely and ask if you're able to contribute. You're always welcome, of course, to do that. And you could do that online or by sending in a donation, which I'll include in the email as well. But thanks again for being here. There's a bit more food and drinks over here if you want to linger for a moment, and we hope to see you either next month or at one of the gatherings in between. Thanks again.